Welcome back. Moving on, we are still on our work session agenda. Moving on, we will now move to the Strategic Plan Committee update. Ms. Christie, do you have an update for us? I have to say, I am enjoying that committee.
Yeah, me too. Well, this will be a much shorter and lighter presentation. Just saying. Hopefully a more pleasant one for everyone. So just to give an update, we did have 2 meetings. We were a little bit behind what we originally had planned because of the weather in January, but we did manage to squeeze in 2 in February. And the committee itself approved a timeline and framework to present to the board. We do have a couple of proposals that we would like to ask the board to consider. We had a discussion about that, and of course anything that we do ask would have to still come back later to the board as a contract, but we would like to get the board's blessing or at least their thoughts on some discussions we had around outside vendors before we proceed with that. And the fabulous Miss Lautner, who's really good at these presentations, actually put together some notes from our meeting. And I'm just going to kind of kick it to you, Kori, if that's okay.
It's like the Miss Lautner show tonight.
I know,
You're doing such a great job.
Y'all are going to get really tired of me. So I will make this quick because some of this you all have seen before. So these first 2 slides are a rehash of a previous presentation I had done, just kind of walking us through what strategic plans for Knox County Schools had looked like in the past as some initial context leading into our strategic planning work for this upcoming cycle. And so the real takeaway from this slide is that strategic planning has been done a number of different ways over the course of the last 15 or so years, and it has produced a number of different types of plans over the last 15 or so years. And so we have, as a district, leveraged everything from staff to board to some external support to develop our strategic plans that we have published for the district. The establishment of those strategic plans has consisted of everything from major goal establishment to establishing some very granular performance objectives to revising and reframing mission and vision statements. The breadth of those documents has spanned from 12 pages in our current iteration to 103 pages if you go back to 2009. And so there's a lot of flexibility in what a strategic plan can consist of. And so we have a lot of opportunity to decide what it is we want this next iteration to look like and contain for Knox County Schools. As a reminder, the last time we discussed strategic planning, we laid out a very high-level roadmap. So we're actually going to take this roadmap a step further in just a moment. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this slide. What I will say is that the board did choose to form a strategic planning committee. You heard Ms. Christie say we've met twice. Ms. Christie is our chair. We are also joined by Ms. Henderson, Reverend Butler, Steve Rudder, our director of REA, and myself. And so we've had a lot of fun together. And over the past 2 meetings, we've had an opportunity to put a lot of dots on a timeline. And this is the timeline that we are proposing to the board as the strategic planning committee. What you see on the screen outlines proposed committee work and proposed board action. You can see there's a lot of back and forth that we're proposing here, and that's intentional. That's the committee really wanting to do this work in coordination with the larger board and make sure that we're checking in every step of the way. And that first check-in is really taking place this week in the form of a proposed vote on Thursday. So the strategic planning framework and the timeline that we are proposing began in February with us just looking over, what is our timeline, what's our proposed framework for engagement going to be. We've moved forward into March, and what we've determined is that we would like to propose to the full board the use of external contractors for 2 elements of this work. We're going to talk about that in just a moment, but we're really talking about 2 separate potential external contractors. One, to help us with stakeholder engagement and to begin a lot more quickly than the other. The other, to really focus on strategic planning. And we're making that request for a couple of different reasons. One, because we do think that there are two very different skill sets between stakeholder engagement and doing that in a deep and meaningful fashion compared to strategic planning and doing that in a deep and meaningful fashion. And also because time is of the essence here. And so we can move a lot more quickly on 2 contracts than we can move on 1 large contract that would have to go through the RFP process. So if the board were to give its approval for the use of 2 independent external contractors, our timeline would look something like this. We would ask for that vote on Thursday. Following the results of that vote, we would begin the process of identifying a vendor specifically for stakeholder engagement later this month. We would then transition in April into bringing a contract to the board to consider and hopefully approve for stakeholder engagement. Following that, we would ideally begin stakeholder engagement. We'll talk a little bit in just a minute about what all that would consist of. We'd run stakeholder engagement from April through May, and we would also simultaneously be thinking about a strategic planning contract as well. So we are anticipating the need for that contract to go through the RFP process, and so that is why you see it potentially initiating a little bit later in this timeline. So ideally, we'd be able to turn around a contract to the board for consideration for strategic planning in June, which would allow us to then hopefully begin the real work of strategic planning in July and August. That work would consist of synthesizing findings from the stakeholder engagement process, and also looking at our major initiatives at the district level, our existing initiative plans, our annual action plan, engaging with the board, and doing a lot of synthesis around what we want to be true in 5 years and backward mapping how we can benchmark ourselves to that goal. In the July workshop, we would also then ideally have a report out from our stakeholder engagement vendors. This is where those 2 worlds start to collide. So remember, we've got 2 separate vendors. They're kind of moving on 2 separate planes right now. And the board is engaging ideally with both of them. So in July, you would hear that report on stakeholder engagement that would be ideally handed then to your strategic planners for that synthesis process. Moving into September, a lot of things potentially happen in September. With the board itself, ideally you have the strategic planning vendor engaging with the board. The committee has proposed at the board annual workshop around some organizational visioning. So that's that opportunity to then take the proposal from the strategic planners and identify, what's an appropriate mission and vision that really captures and frames the heart of that work and the spirit behind it. In September, we would also ideally, and I think this is a really important step, and it's one that is often missed in the strategic planning process. We talked a lot about it at the committee level. I think the entire committee felt very strongly about doing this. We would also take that initial proposal from the strategic planners back for another round of stakeholder engagement. So that would be kind of our validation process. Is the plan that we are proposing, does it resemble what we heard from the community? Does the community recognize and see their input in that proposed plan? Is the language that we're using accessible? Does it resonate with the community? Or do we need to try to do some redrafting, some reframing, and go back to the drawing board? So depending on how well that validation process goes, we would be doing potentially some synthesis and some finalization through the month of October with those strategic planners in the board committee to prepare to bring an initial plan to the full board for consideration and for a vote in November. We've also built in some time for some potential revisioning and reframing again following that conversation, just to give us a little bit of padding and a little bit of opportunity to do one last pass at finalizing that 5-year strategic plan with the intent of bringing it ideally for a final vote if necessary in December, which would allow us to begin our new 5-year plan in January of 2025, which seems wild. So what you all will be asked to consider, what the board will be asked to consider on Thursday, again, is the use. So we don't have contracts yet, and this is in kind of an odd request, and we talked a lot with Mr. Dupler about how to potentially navigate this. We are asking that the board consider approving the use of 2 external contractors for this work, and that is because if the board does not have an appetite for that, if the board would like for us to proceed in a different direction, we just need that decision sooner rather than later, so we can go back to committee and we can do some revisioning early on and some planning around how we want to revise that strategic planning framework to either do the work internally or do the work as a board committee. So if the board were to approve the use of 2 external vendors, we're really looking at 2 separate procurement processes based on what we anticipate the potential cost for these 2 contracts to be. We imagine that the cost for stakeholder engagement would be a little bit less than the cost for strategic planning. So we're anticipating stakeholder engagement falling somewhere in the range of $25,000 to $50,000. That would put us in informal bid territory. So really all we would need to do is requisition 3 quotes, and I can turn it over to Ms. Christie here in just a moment. She's going to talk through a little bit more of what the committee was anticipating in terms of how to go about that process and vetting those prospective contracts and vendors. For the strategic planning contract, we are anticipating that might crest the $50,000 threshold. If it does, we will need to have gone through RFP, so we would like to go ahead and just put that proposal out on the street to be on the safe side. And so that would be a contract, a proposal that we would need to go ahead and send to procurement sooner rather than later to make sure that they are ready and able to move on that process. So, kind of frame what we're talking about, and also I will say those colors were not as bright on my computer. I apologize. That's very bright. So if you can ignore the color scheme. Stakeholder engagement, again, we're looking at an informal bid for this process. You can kind of see where the stakeholder engagement elements of the timeline, we've pulled those down into this box. So those are kind of your primary touches where stakeholder engagement specifically is concerned, and we would be looking for a facilitator who could facilitate and conduct multilingual, multimodal engagement with a large number of stakeholders and a very diverse number of stakeholders. And so when we say multimodal, we mean everything from surveys to focus groups, in English, Spanish, Kirundi, Swahili. You know, we have a lot of languages that are spoken throughout the district, and we want to be responsive to that and engage our families in the language that is most comfortable for them. We have asked that, or we would ask that a stakeholder engagement vendor would then compile and report on the results of their findings to the full board, and also provide that report to a strategic planning consultant along with all of their raw data as well. For strategic planning, again, we are anticipating needing to go through the RFP process for this, and really what we would be asking of a strategic planning vendor would be to analyze that feedback, to also look at our priorities as a district, to look at what the board wants to be true, what is the board's 5-year vision for success, look at all of our existing initiatives. That's everything from our Region 5 strategic plan to our 865 Academies work, to all of our other sort of mini initiatives that are currently in operation throughout the district, and make sure that there's a coherent line of forward momentum, and we're not stutter-stepping with any of our existing work to accommodate for a 5-year strategic plan. We are also asking that that vendor generate a comprehensive, easily digestible, this was very important to the committee at large, that this be an easily digestible document, 5-year framework to deliver on ambitious but ultimately achievable long-term goals. And we are asking that this particular contract is the one that include that organizational visioning. So that's where the board would kind of huddle up and go through the process of establishing potentially a new mission and vision statement for the district. And you can see the timeline that is relevant to strategic planning also laid out at the bottom of that box. Oh, and I am finished in turning it over to Ms. Christie.
All right. And Mr. Dupler, you might want to add something, or Reverend Butler or Ms. Henderson if you want to add to it. But one of the biggest things was, you know, in talking about the informal bid, once we get those quotes, that would still have to come back to the board. But the thought behind that was we would like to gauge, you know, how the board feels about that before we go out and solicit quotes or put out an RFP, because if you do that and then you come back in April and it gets voted down, then you wasted 2 months. So certainly don't want to be in that position. And I don't know if Ms. Henderson, Dr. Butler, is there anything we missed here?
I don't think so.
All right.
I think that covered that.
Yeah.
There was one last slide. Did you want to cover this one? Sorry, I sat down too soon.
Yeah. So the stakeholder engagement, that was the email we discussed, people could send input to, right? And then for the strategic planning, if the board is agreeable, we would put out an RFP for that. And we talked a little bit about like the work Katamba did, creating the Region 5 Way. And their work, that was they're not a local organization, but just in terms of what we're looking for.
And I would say this slide probably should have been labeled a little differently, and that was on me. This was just, I think Reverend Butler, you may have raised this point, wanting to ask the question that if the board does vote to approve the use of external vendors, how could they get in contact with us? And so we did just want to have something that we could attach to an agenda that would outline how they would express interest. And so that is what this slide is speaking to. Sorry.
Mr. Watson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think the title does a good job. I'm assuming you don't want the public just to start emailing that address with their feedback at that point. So that's good. Thank you all for all the work on this, and Ms. Christie, and thank you for the explanation. And just two questions. One, I'm assuming the recommendation from the committee is to go look for external vendors, and ideally two, right? So, to me, I'm going to heed the recommendation of the committee because, you all have given way more thought to it than I have, so I appreciate that. And let me ask this question. I noticed in the history that you gave, there was a couple times in the strategic planning process that a new mission and vision was articulated. There was one time when it was not. You also mentioned that we'll kind of get recommendations about the strategic plan and then form a mission and vision out of that. To me, that's really backward. Any time I've ever heard about strategic planning or been involved in it, mission and vision kind of sets the tone for everything else. I get that this is a public entity and board members change and all the things, right? Is there a reason why we're not leading with our mission and vision that's already articulated to say filtering that should, to me, that would be important in an RFP, for them to understand what bones are you bringing to the table? And then I've got one more additional question, but that probably needs to be answered first.
So thank you. That's a good question because we spent
no
quite
doubt.
a few minutes talking about that. I always knew which came first, the chicken or the egg. But in this case, we didn't know which ones were the chicken and which one was the egg.
I got you.
So I think that's going to happen in September, and that's kind of at the beginning of the strategic planning process of after they had synthesized the findings and have drafted a plan. And we want to make sure that our mission, goals, and visions are consistent with what they have. So that discussion would happen at our annual workshop. And then if there is any more synthesizing or feedback to do, they still have time to do that. If we were to do that prior to hearing from the public, it would be like we made up our mind what we want to do before we've heard from.
Yeah.
And the timing of it, I think, was that September workshop was a good timing, that they've done enough work, but they haven't done too much that we would be disruptive to the process.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So here would be my recommendation, and I'm not saying that what I'm saying is not what you all are saying. I just want to be clear. I think in order to even start the strategic planning process, you have to have a mission and vision identified. You have to kind of start there, and we do have one. And so my encouragement would be, let's lead with that and say, hey, here's our current mission and vision. And through the process, if we decide to modify, that's different than we're not articulating a mission and vision. We're going to go through the strategic planning process, and then we're going to create a mission and vision. to me, that is the chicken and the egg, and yeah.
Well, yeah.
So I would encourage that. Yeah.
Well, and we actually spoke a little bit about that,
Yeah.
about how we have our annual action plan.
Right.
You know, we have the Reach in 5 way. I mean, we have other, you know, guidelines there.
Yeah.
So, and we did discuss that, but we did not want to specifically lead with that because we didn't want the community to feel like that we didn't want to hear about
Right.
anything
There's
else.
already a box. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
We wanted them to feel free to share anything they wanted to.
Yeah.
In that context. So.
And if I may,
Yeah.
if you go to, I think, the next slide, or 2 slides after that, that one.
Yeah.
You'll see it says, for under the strategic planning, analyze stakeholder feedback, priorities, board vision, outcomes, existing initiatives. So they're looking at what we have.
Sure.
So I was saying, I think the same thing. They're
Yeah.
going to start with what we have, but somewhere in that process, we're going to say, let's just make sure that we, after hearing everything, that we still have those same mission and goals and vision.
Yeah. And
Vision, mission, and goals.
I thought there was a chance we were saying the same thing. I just didn't want to make the assumption. The last thing that I would encourage the board to consider through the strategic planning process, and also it would need to be a part of the RFP because it would be an intentional part of that scope of work. And I'm not trying to complicate things, but one thing that KCS, especially at its size, does not have articulated. You do a great job articulating the priorities and people aligned around that. KCS, like any organization, if you're around it long enough, you'll get a sense of what their core values are. Whether or not they codified them or not. It doesn't matter if they ever put them on a brochure. If you spend enough time within an organization or with an individual, you'll get a sense of what their core values are. I think it's really smart for organizations to take the time to codify them. And here's the difference, and here's the reason why core values are so important. Core values, when you filter your decision-making through core values, it helps you decide the particular solution you're going to bring to a problem. There's lots of solutions potentially to a given problem, but there's some things I will not do because it does not align with my core values. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? And so it also affects the way we posture ourselves. And to me, when I looked at the history of this in this organization, the last set of core values, I'm pretty sure this is right, Terry told me this, it was a board chair, this is probably, well, roughly 8 years ago, now I've done dated it, if anybody wants to go look it up, who literally wrote their own set of core values and brought them to a board meeting and asked for them to be passed, and they were. They lived for like a very short period of time in an old strategic planning document. That's not the way to do it. But I would encourage the board to consider that because that's a topic just like the priorities are. Do you ever go to a meeting and not talk about the priorities? Probably not, right? Which is a good thing, right? Because it's all about alignment, right? Those core values, they need to be lived out in at least 3 areas. That is the way we reflect our relationship with our core constituency, which is students, right? That's got to be reflected in that, students and parents. They also have to be reflected in the way we interact within our team, right? So teacher and within the school and all that. They also have to be reflective of the way we interact with the larger community. So to me, it's a really powerful alignment tool to say, here's how we said we're going to act in these spaces. Here's how we're going to posture ourselves, and we're going to filter our decision-making through it. I'm not going to be here long term. If y'all don't want to do it, it's fine. But I think it's something to consider in the strategic planning process, and that's why I haven't brought it up in the past, because we had a strategic plan. But to me, now that we're thinking about this is the time to potentially decide, do we want to codify our core values? We have them, and if anybody's been in this organization long enough, they get a sense of what they are. But I would challenge the board now to actually codify them, and that is an opportunity, not just for a brochure. I have no interest in that. But it's an opportunity to continue to create more alignment within the district. So,
Thank you, Mr. Watson. Ms. Warren?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the work that you guys have done on the strategic plan thus far and look forward to living through at least part of it. So I would be fine with the procurement process that you've laid out here. And I'm kind of like Mr. Watson. If that's what the committee is comfortable with, I think that's a great idea. Thank you.
Ms. Owen?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Maybe Ms. Horn can help me remember. I think when we were working on the strategic plan last time, I don't think we intended to change the mission and vision. I think that just sort of occurred as we were working, and that we just felt like it needed to be changed as we went. So I don't think we sat down initially and said, we're going to change it. Thank you.
Yep. Is there any more discussion on that? Okay. All right. Thank you, Ms. Lautner, Ms. Christie, for that presentation, and we will see that item come back up in a little bit on our agenda.